Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of the shooting range, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the M4 rifle. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the Nevada training facility, and sweat already beaded on her forehead despite the early hour. Around her, 30 other recruits prepared for what would become the most challenging marksmanship test of their military careers. She had dreamed of this moment for years. Growing up in a small Texas town, Sarah had watched her father clean his hunting rifles every Sunday after church. He never let her touch them, always saying that guns were not toys for little girls. But Sarah had observed everything: the careful way he aligned the sights, the steady breathing technique, the gentle squeeze of the trigger. She practiced with sticks and toy guns, imagining herself as a sharpshooter who could hit any target. At 23, she was one of only 3 women in the elite military training program. The other recruits, mostly men with impressive military backgrounds, had already demonstrated their shooting skills during the preliminary tests. Sarah had barely qualified, her scores hovering just above the minimum requirements. But she was here, and that was what mattered. The head instructor, a weathered man named Sergeant Collins, walked down the line of recruits. His voice boomed across the range as he explained the day's exercise. They would fire at targets placed at various distances, starting close and moving progressively farther away. Each recruit had 50 rounds to prove their worth. Those who failed would be dismissed from the program immediately. Sarah Quota's stomach churned as she watched the first few recruits take their positions. The sound of gunfire echoed across the desert landscape, and she could see the satisfaction on their faces as they hit their marks consistently. When her turn approached, she took a deep breath and remembered everything she had learned during the weeks of preparation. The first target stood 50 yards away. Sarah raised her rifle, aligned the sights carefully, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the dirt 2 feet to the left of the target. Frustrated murmurs rippled through the group of watching recruits. She adjusted her aim and fired again. This time, the bullet went high, missing the target completely. As the morning progressed, Sarah's performance only worsened. Target after target remained untouched as her bullets flew wide, high, or low. The other recruits began to exchange glances, and she could feel their eyes on her back. Some whispered among themselves, questioning why she had been allowed into the program in the first place. Sergeant Collins approached her position, his expression unreadable. Sarah expected him to pull her from the line and send her packing, but instead he simply observed her technique for a few moments before moving on to the next recruit. His silence felt worse than any criticism he could have offered. By lunch break, Sarah had used 37 of her 50 rounds without hitting a single target. She sat alone at the edge of the range, staring at her rifle and fighting back tears of frustration. The weapon that had seemed so familiar in training now felt foreign in her hands. Every technique she had practiced seemed to abandon her when it mattered most. The afternoon session would determine her fate. 13 bullets stood between her and either achieving her dream or facing the humiliation of failure. As the other recruits returned from lunch, many of them had already completed the exercise successfully. Sarah could see the confidence in their posture, the satisfied smiles on their faces. They belonged here. She was beginning to doubt that she did. The afternoon heat was becoming unbearable when Sarah returned to her shooting position. Her uniform clung to her body with perspiration, and her hands felt slippery against the rifle's grip. The other recruits had formed small groups, discussing their morning successes and sharing shooting tips. Sarah remained isolated, carrying the weight of her 37 consecutive misses like a heavy burden. Commander Jake Morrison, the SEAL instructor who supervised the advanced training program, emerged from the command tent. Unlike Sergeant Collins, who ran the basic training, Morrison was legendary among military circles. He had completed multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, leading some of the most dangerous special operations missions. His presence at the range meant this test carried more significance than Sarah had initially understood. Morrison was a tall man with piercing blue eyes and graying hair at his temples. His movements were precise and economical, never wasting energy or motion. When he spoke, everyone listened. Even the veteran sergeants showed him deep respect. Sarah had only seen him twice during her weeks at the facility, and both times he had observed the training from a distance without interacting. With the recruits. Now he stood near the command table, reviewing score sheets with Sergeant Collins. Sarah caught glimpses of their conversation and noticed Collins shaking his head while pointing in her direction. Her heart sank as she realized they were discussing her performance. She imagined the conversation focusing on her complete inability to hit even the closest targets. When the afternoon session began, Sarah positioned herself at the firing line once more. The targets seemed to mock her from their positions across the range. 50 yards, 100 yards, 150 yards. Distances that should have been manageable for someone who had made it this far in training. Yet she had failed to connect with any of them. She fired her 38th round. Miss. The 39th sailed over the target completely. Number 40 struck the ground several feet short. Each failure felt like a nail in the coffin of her military dreams. The other recruits had stopped watching her entirely, focusing instead on their own exercises or engaging in casual conversation. Sarah Quota's hands began to shake more noticeably as she prepared for her 41st shot. The trembling made it impossible to maintain steady aim, and she knew that her nervousness was making everything worse. She tried breathing exercises, muscle relaxation techniques, and mental visualization. Nothing helped. The rifle felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Shot 41 missed wide to the right. 42 went high again. By the time she reached her 45th round, Sarah could feel tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. Only 5 bullets remained between her and complete failure. 5 chances to salvage some dignity from this disaster. She glanced over at Commander Morrison, who was now standing closer to the firing line, arms crossed as he observed the various exercises. His expression revealed nothing, but Sarah felt certain he was witnessing her humiliation. This legendary warrior was watching her prove that she didn't belong among elite soldiers. The 46th shot missed low. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to center herself one more time. When she opened them, she noticed that Morrison had moved even closer. He was now standing directly behind the firing line, close enough that she could hear his breathing. Shot 47 flew wide to the left, nearly hitting the neighboring target frame. Sarah's face burned with embarrassment. She had never felt so incompetent in her entire life. The rifle in her hands might as well have been a broken tool for all the good it was doing. Her. 3 bullets remained. 3 final opportunities to avoid complete failure. Sarah raised the rifle one more time, knowing that in a few minutes she would be packing her bags and heading home to Texas, where she would have to explain to everyone who had believed in her why she couldn't even hit a stationary target from 50 yards away. Sarah's 48th shot went wide again, disappearing into the desert sand beyond the target range. The sound of the rifle seemed louder now, echoing her failure across the empty landscape. She could feel eyes on her from every direction, recruits who had finished their exercises, instructors taking notes, and somewhere behind her, Commander Morrison's steady presence. 2 bullets left. Sarah's hands were shaking so violently now that she could barely hold the rifle steady. Her breathing had become irregular, coming in short gasps that made precise aiming impossible. Everything her father had taught her about hunting, everything she had learned in basic training, every hour spent practicing at the range, it all seemed meaningless now. She thought about the phone call she would have to make to her family. Her younger brother Miguel, who looked up to her and had told all his friends that his sister was training to be a Special Forces soldier. Her mother, who had initially worried about Sarah's military aspirations, but had eventually become her strongest supporter. Her father, who had finally admitted he was proud of her decision to serve, even though he had never taught her to shoot properly. The 49th shot felt different as Sarah squeezed the trigger. For just a moment, everything seemed to align, her breathing, her stance, her grip on the rifle. But the bullet still missed, striking the target frame but not the scoring area. So close, yet still a complete failure in terms of the exercise requirements. Sarah lowered her rifle and stared at the final bullet in the chamber. Around her, the desert seemed to grow quiet. Even the wind had stopped blowing. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. This was it. Her last chance to salvage something from the worst shooting performance anyone at the facility had probably ever witnessed. She raised the rifle one final time, knowing that in 30 seconds, her military dreams would be over. The target at 50 yards looked impossibly small now, even though it was the same size it had been all morning. Her vision seemed to blur slightly from exhaustion and stress. The weapon felt foreign in her hands, like she was holding it for the first time. As Sarah began to align her sights for the 50th and final shot, she became aware of movement behind her. Someone was approaching her position. She didn't dare turn around to look, but she could sense the person getting closer. Heavy footsteps on the gravel, the soft sound of military boots moving with purpose. Then she heard a voice, low and calm, speaking just loud enough for her to hear. It was Commander Morrison's voice, and his words were completely unexpected. "Stop." Sarah froze, her finger still on the trigger but not yet applying pressure. She didn't know if she should lower the rifle or continue with her final shot. The command had been clear, but she wasn't sure what it meant. "Lower your weapon," Morrison said, still in that same calm tone. "Step back from the firing line." Sarah's heart sank. He was ending her humiliation before she could waste her final bullet. She was being dismissed from the program without even getting to use all 50 rounds. In a way, it was a mercy. She wouldn't have hit the target anyway, and at least this way she could avoid the finality of that 50th missed dot. She lowered the rifle and took a step backward, expecting Morrison to tell her to pack her equipment and report to the administration building. Instead, he moved to stand directly beside her, his presence both intimidating and somehow comforting. "Hand me your rifle," he said quietly. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then passed the weapon to him. Morrison examined it briefly, checking the chamber and the sight alignment. His movements were quick and professional, the actions of someone who had handled thousands of weapons over the course of his career. "There's something wrong with your rifle," he announced, loud enough for everyone on the range to hear. Commander Morrison's words sent a ripple of surprise through the assembled recruits and instructors. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat as she watched him examine her rifle more closely. His experienced hands moved over the weapon with practiced precision, checking components that she wouldn't have even known to inspect. "The rear sight has been damaged," Morrison announced, his voice carrying across the range. "The alignment is completely off. This weapon couldn't hit a target accurately no matter who was firing it." Sergeant Collins approached quickly, taking the rifle from Morrison's hands to examine it himself. After a few moments, he nodded grimly. "You're right, sir. Looks like it was damaged during transport or storage. The adjustment mechanism is bent and the sight picture is showing at least 6 inches off at 50 yards. Sarah felt her legs go weak. For the past 6 hours, she had been blaming herself for every missed shot, convinced that her failure was due to her own incompetence. The shame and self-doubt that had been building inside her suddenly transformed into a mixture of relief and anger. She had been set up for failure from the very beginning, through no fault of her own. "How long has she been using this rifle?" Morrison asked Collins. "Since the beginning of the exercise, sir. It was assigned to her this morning from the standard equipment pool." Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sarah could see that he was not pleased with this development. Equipment failure was unacceptable in any military operation, but during a crucial evaluation exercise, it was potentially career-ending for the recruit involved. "Get her a replacement weapon," Morrison ordered. "And I want every rifle in the equipment pool inspected immediately. This cannot happen again." Sarah watched as Collins hurried away to retrieve another rifle. Around her, the other recruits were murmuring among themselves, and she could see new expressions on their faces. Where before there had been dismissal and barely concealed contempt, now there was curiosity and something that might have been respect. She had endured 6 hours of failure and humiliation without giving up or making excuses. When Collins returned with the replacement rifle, Morrison took it and conducted his own inspection. He worked the action, checked the sights, and even fired a test shot into the backstop to ensure proper function. Only when he was satisfied did he hand the weapon to Sarah. "You have 1 shot remaining," he said simply. "Make it count." Sarah accepted the new rifle, immediately noticing how different it felt in her hands. The weight was properly balanced, and when she looked through the sights, the alignment was clean and precise. For the first time all day, the weapon felt like an extension of her body, rather than an alien object. She moved back to the firing line, acutely aware that every person on the range was now watching her. The pressure was enormous, but it was different from what she had felt before. Now she knew that her previous failures had not been due to her own inadequacy. She had one chance to prove that all those hours of practice, all that training, had not been wasted. The target at 50 yards looked different now. Through the properly aligned sights, she could clearly see the scoring rings. Her breathing steadied, and her hands stopped shaking. The tremor that had plagued her all day disappeared as muscle memory took over. Sarah took her stance, raising the rifle to her shoulder with smooth, practiced motions. She found her sight picture, controlled her breathing, and began the trigger squeeze that she had rehearsed thousands of times. The desert around her seemed to fall silent, as if the entire world was waiting to see what would happen next. Behind her, Commander Morrison stood perfectly still, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But Sarah could feel his attention, focused on her like a laser beam. This shot would determine not just whether she passed the exercise, but whether she had the mental fortitude to overcome adversity and perform under extreme pressure. Time seemed to slow as Sarah lined up her sights on the 50-yard target. Her breathing had found its natural rhythm, and the rifle felt steady in her hands for the first time all day. Through the properly aligned scope, she could see the black circle at the center of the target with perfect clarity. Everything her father had tried to teach her during those Sunday afternoons, everything she had learned in basic training, suddenly clicked into place. She squeezed the trigger with steady, gradual pressure, just as she had been taught. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the desert. For a split second, nobody moved. Then Sergeant Collins raised his binoculars to examine the target. "Bull's eye," he called out, his voice filled with surprise and admiration. Dead center of the target. The range erupted in applause and cheers from the other recruits. Sarah lowered her rifle, hardly believing what she had just accomplished. After 49 consecutive misses with a damaged weapon, she had placed her final shot directly in the center of the target with a properly functioning rifle. But the celebration was short-lived. Commander Morrison raised his hand for silence, and the range immediately grew quiet. Sarah felt her stomach drop, wondering if somehow she had still failed the exercise. 1 hit out of 50 attempts was hardly an impressive shooting score, even with the equipment malfunction taken into account. Morrison stepped forward, his expression serious. "Recruit Martinez," he said, his voice carrying across the range. "Step forward." Sarah approached him on unsteady legs, the rifle still in her hands. She expected to be dismissed from the program despite her final successful shot. After all, the exercise had required multiple hits at various distances, and she had managed only one. "What you just demonstrated," Morrison began, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "is one of the most important qualities we look for in special operations personnel. You faced failure after failure, public humiliation, and equipment that was working against you. Not once did you quit. Not once did you make excuses. Not once did you ask for help or special consideration." Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, but she blinked them back. Morrison continued speaking, his gaze fixed directly on her. "When I watched you struggling with that damaged rifle, I could have intervened earlier. I could have stopped the exercise and had your weapon checked. But I wanted to see what you were made of. I wanted to know if you would quit when things got difficult, or if you had the mental toughness to persevere through adversity." He paused, looking around at the assembled recruits and instructors. In real combat situations, equipment fails. Plans go wrong. Everything that can go wrong usually does go wrong. When that happens, we don't need soldiers who fall apart under pressure. We need people who keep fighting, keep trying, keep pushing forward even when success seems impossible. Morrison turned his attention back to Sarah. "Your final shot proves that you have the fundamental skills necessary for marksmanship. Your behavior during the previous 49 attempts proves that you have something much more valuable, the mental fortitude to succeed in special operations." Sarah could hardly believe what she was hearing. The day that had started as a complete disaster was somehow turning into something entirely different. "Furthermore," Morrison continued, "I'm recommending you for immediate advancement to Phase 2 of the Special Operations Training Program. Your performance today demonstrates exactly the kind of character we need in our elite units." The applause from the other recruits was thunderous this time. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sudden change in her circumstances. In the span of a few minutes, she had gone from facing dismissal to being fast-tracked for advanced training. As the other recruits crowded around to congratulate her, Sarah caught sight of Commander Morrison watching from a distance. He gave her a small nod of approval before turning to walk back toward the command tent. 3 years later, Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of another shooting range, but this time she was the instructor. The desert training facility looked much the same, but her perspective had changed completely. She wore the distinctive insignia of the Special Operations Unit she had joined after completing her advanced training, and her reputation as both a marksman and a leader had spread throughout the military community. The story of her disastrous first day at the range had become something of a legend among recruits. New soldiers arriving at the facility would often hear whispered versions of the tale, how a young woman had missed 49 consecutive shots before nailing a perfect bullseye on her final attempt. Some versions of the story were embellished beyond recognition, but the core message remained the same: never give up, even when everything seems hopeless. Sarah had gone on to complete some of the most challenging military training programs in the world. She had served in combat zones where her marksmanship skills and mental toughness had saved lives. She had been decorated for valor and had been selected to train other special operations personnel. But she never forgot the lesson she had learned that day when Commander Morrison lifted his hand to stop her from firing her 50th shot. Now, as she watched a new group of recruits struggling with their own shooting exercises, she recognized the signs of frustration and self-doubt that she had experienced years earlier. One young man in particular was having difficulty, his shots consistently missing the targets despite obvious technical skill. Sarah approached him quietly, observing his technique without immediately offering advice. "Sergeant," the recruit said, his voice tight with frustration, "I don't understand what's going wrong. I was an expert marksman in basic training, but nothing is working today." Sarah studied his rifle carefully, checking the sights and the action. Unlike her own experience, this weapon appeared to be functioning perfectly. Sometimes the equipment wasn't the problem. Sometimes the challenge was entirely mental. "Tell me what you're thinking about when you line up your shot," she said. The recruit paused, considering the question. "I'm thinking about not missing, about all the people watching, about what happens if I fail this exercise." Sarah nodded, understanding completely. "You're thinking about everything except hitting the target. Your mind is focused on failure rather than success." She helped him adjust his stance slightly, then stepped back. "I want you to forget about everyone watching. Forget about passing or failing. Just focus on putting that bullet exactly where you want it to go, one shot at a time." The recruit fired, and his bullet struck the outer ring of the target. Not perfect, but a significant improvement. He looked up at Sarah with surprise and renewed confidence. "Better," she said, "but I want to tell you something that might help even more." She gestured for him to lower his weapon and give her his full attention. 7 years ago, I stood on this same range and missed 49 consecutive shots. I was using a rifle with damaged sights, but I didn't know that at the time. I thought I was the worst marksman in military history. I was ready to quit, to give up everything I had worked for because I believed I wasn't good enough. The recruit's eyes widened. He had obviously heard versions of the story, but hearing it directly from the person involved carried much more weight. "What I learned that day," Sarah continued, "is that success isn't just about hitting the target every time. It's about how you respond when you miss. It's about what you do when everything goes wrong and you want to quit. That's when you discover who you really are." The recruit raised his rifle again, and Sarah could see that his entire demeanor had changed. The tension in his shoulders had relaxed, and his breathing was more controlled. He fired again, this time hitting much closer to the center of the target. "Much better," Sarah said. "Remember, every expert was once a beginner. Every professional was once an amateur. The only difference between success and failure is the willingness to keep trying when things get difficult." As she walked away from the recruit, Sarah thought about Commander Morrison. who had retired from active duty the previous year. She had kept in touch with him, and he had told her that her story had become part of the curriculum he used when training other instructors. The lesson had spread far beyond that single day on the desert range. Sarah looked up at the clear blue sky above the Nevada desert, remembering the moment when Morrison had lifted his hand to stop her from firing her final shot. That gesture had changed the trajectory of her entire life. It had taught her that sometimes failure is not about personal inadequacy, but about circumstances beyond our control. More importantly, it had shown her that true character is revealed not in moments of easy success, but in how we respond to adversity. The lesson that had saved her military career that day continued to guide her in every challenge she faced, and now she was passing it on to the next generation of soldiers who would carry it forward into their own moments of trial and triumph.